When we speak of civil liberties and civil rights, people are beginning to understand that the most fundamental of these is the right to work in our society. And what is occurring in Guyana is that the government is making political capital out of the indefensible position of one who is either unemployed or is very close to the line of being unemployed.
I want to say to you all in no uncertain terms that this government is disrespectful to black people. And if people disrespect you, you have a right to disrespect them.
I am saying now that we have started, now that we have come together, do not sleep. Don't let us go back quietly into the night. Protest must be the order of the day.
Many years it took. Now we found the natural look. Many years it took us to get this natural look. Suddenly out of the blue, this thing has shot like something new. Everybody young and old going afro and telling the world, if you hear them, black is beautiful. Look at the glass. Black is beautiful. It's the texture, of course. Lift your head like me. You have to wear me collar with dignity. How it go now? Black is beautiful. I said, sing it out loud. Black is beautiful. So I'm black and proud. It's high time that we get rid of that old slave mentality. Sing. Sing the chorus. Let me hear you. Sing it, sing it. It's quite important, simple though it seems. We have achieved what once was thought a dream. We have been imitating in the past. Now we have found our very own at last. No more hot comb to press the hair, and no more bleach cream to make us clear. Proudly I say, without pretext, no more inferiority complex, because we know that black is beautiful. Look at the glass. Black is beautiful. It's the texture, of course. Lift your head like me. You have to wear me collar with dignity. How it go now? Black is beautiful. So sing it along. Black is beautiful. So I'm black and proud. It's high time that we get rid of that old slave mentality. Sing it. Black is beautiful. Everybody sing it, sing it. Black is beautiful. Sing it. My brother, why do you deny the fact? When someone says that you are black, your skin is very clear, I do agree. But don't you know you're a black man just like me? There is no in-between in race. You've got to find your rightful place. Living a life no pretext shows your inferiority complex. Don't you know that? Black is beautiful. Look at the shine. Black is beautiful. It's yours, it's mine. Lift your head like me. You have to wear the collar with dignity. How it go now? Black is beautiful. I said, sing it out loud. Black is beautiful. So I'm black and proud. It's high time that we get rid of that old slave mentality. Higher. Black is beautiful. Black is beautiful. I hope you don't misunderstand me now. I'm not comparing us with anyone. I'm only saying that people that we are should never feel ourselves inferior. The Lord above who made the night and day has given both their equal parts to play. Now if you are on our side, open your mouth and sing it with pride. Let me hear you sing. Black is beautiful. Sing it out loud. Black is beautiful. Say I'm black and proud. Lift your head like me. You have to wear me collar with dignity. Oh, it go now. Black is beautiful. Sing it out loud. Black is beautiful. It's high time that we get rid of that old slave mentality. And let me hear you say, black is beautiful. Look at the glass. Black is beautiful. It's a texture of us. And lift your head like me. You got to wear the collar with dignity.
Hello and good afternoon to you, and welcome to this impromptu WPA press statement, press release that we want to share with you. Thanks for joining us at this late notice. WPA welcomes the United Nations launch of a second decade of the people of African descent. We think this is a very progressive step by the world body, which launched the first decade in 2015. As the UN contended at that time, despite anti-discrimination legislation by governments, African peoples across the globe continue to be victims of structural racism. It called on governments to use the decade to address this malady. The designation of a second decade suggests that the UN is not satisfied that this objective has been adequately addressed. WPA feels that Guyana, which is a signatory to this UN initiative, has failed miserably in this regard. While the David Granger-led coalition government committed to meet its obligation by granting an annual subvention to the local umbrella body, IPADG, the succeeding PPP government almost immediately moved in the opposite direction. It withdrew the subvention on the unproven and downright false grounds that IPADG was misusing the funds. The government failed to separate its partisan politics from the larger responsibility of the state of Guyana to honor and respect the right of its individual ethno-racial groups to recognition, justice, and development as mandated by the UN. The PPP government, which coincided with the second half of the decade, appeared to be tone deaf on the matter. Instances of extrajudicial killings of African Guyanese men continued, even as resistance to government's arbitrary acquisition of African Guyanese lands was met with brute force by the police. On the economic front, African Guyanese workers, particularly those in the public sector, have been denied a living wage in the midst of the country's increased revenues from the oil windfall. In the meantime, the government turned a blind eye to the documented imbalance in the distribution of state resources to the country's ethnic groups, with African Guyanese lagging far behind other groups. Instead of working with IPADG to realize the goals of the decade, the government sought to divide the African Guyanese community by setting up parallel and competing groups with the overt blessings of the ruling party. The first UN-designated decade, therefore, ended with no discernible shift in the status quo, In fact, the government went to pains to contend that structural discrimination against African Guyanese does not exist. This in the face of documented evidence and historical truths about the consequences of slavery and colonialism on African Guyanese, who were the prime victims of these inhumane systems. WPA condemns the government for this gross insensitivity towards one of our major ethnic groups. We feel that the government's action, coming from a ruling party whose composition and support base are derived from a competing ethnic group, is ultimately unhelpful to national cohesion. Against this background, WPA urges the African Guyanese community to aggressively take steps to ensure that the second decade yields better results. Ultimately, as the African American freedom fighter Frederick Douglass warned, power concedes nothing without a demand. Second, we call on African Guyanese and their organizations to become overtly political in their activism. Separating cultural activism from politics is foolhardy. Slavery, colonialism, and neocolonialism were first and foremost political in their orientations and practice. Third, WPA also calls on the government to honor its obligations to its darkest citizens who have disproportionately suffered as Guyana evolved. Fourth, as the second decade begins, we demand a reinstatement of the subvention to IPADG. Fifth, we urge the government to immediately include African Guyanese history in the school curriculum. Sixth, we call on the University of Guyana to begin work towards setting up an African and African Guyanese department at the university. Seven, we call for the setting up of an African Guyanese task force with the express aim of recommending initiatives to the government to break down the walls of structural discrimination and racism in Guyana. Eight, we demand that the government begins forthwith a process of racial equity in the distribution of state resources. Finally, WPA salutes IPADG for the sterling work it continues to do in the face of government hostility and urges the organization and its officers to stay the course. For us in the WPA, IPADG is our organization of the decade. End of statement. We want to say that we have issued this statement because we feel that given the multi-ethnic nature of our society, that it is imperative that the government pays attention to the mandate set out by the UN. It is no accident that the UN has designated 2 decades to this issue. We note that they had previously dedicated 2 decades to the Amerindian or indigenous peoples. Those 2 decades were justified. And so 2 decades to African Guyanese are justified. African Guyanese came to Guyana against their will. They were brought here in chains, in shackles. They were made to work without pay for over 200 years. And when emancipation came in 1834, they faced another 150 years of colonial rule. During that time, it was African labor that humanized the coastland of Guyana. It was African labor without compensation that was responsible for digging the canals and for paving the roads and for turning the wild coast into a tame coast. And all this, I repeat, they did without compensation. And today, 200 years later almost, while slavery has gone and colonialism has gone, African people still bear the scars of bondage. And it is those scars that the United Nations is urging the governments of the world, including the government of Guyana, to begin healing and getting rid of. And so therefore, the state of Guyana has an important role that they must play in ridding Guyana of structural racism against African Guyanese. That our teachers, our public servants do not get a living wage is partly the work of direct action by the PPP, but is partly historical and structural. We were driven from our farmlands, driven from our businesses into the public sector. We taught Guyana, we nourished the Guyana, we kept Guyana in good health. We dug the canals for Guyana. And so therefore Guyana owes the African Guyanese not charity. They owe the African Guyanese repairing, healing the scars of bondage. And so therefore, as we go into this second decade, WPA feels that meeting the demands of the decade must be at the very top of the national agenda. The People's Progressive Party, which by maybe accident of history is an Indian Guyanese-based party. And when it is in government, it has more than a passing responsibility to be sensitive to the condition of other ethnic groups, including African Guyanese. That they have not been sensitive to the condition of African Guyanese is the crime of last century and this century. And that crime must be arrested. No longer must the PPP be allowed to dictate to African Guyanese. WPA says that if we are going to hold together as a cohesive nation, as we must, then paying attention to the African Guyanese condition is imperative. And it is in that spirit that we welcome the second decade. And we urge African Guyanese, wherever they are, and also other ethnic groups, to put our shoulders together and get on with this project. We now have wealth beyond our imagination. And the distribution of that wealth will become a contentious, has already become a contentious issue. And so therefore, we must together work to make this decade, this second decade that begins this month, a more fruitful decade for removing the scars of bondage from the African Guyanese psyche. When the scars of bondage from the African Guyanese psyche are removed, the scars of bondage will also be removed from all of Guyana. WPA salutes ITPADG again, and to say that ITPADG represents over 75 African Guyanese organizations must stay the course, continue to do the work that history has bestowed upon them. We urge those African Guyanese organizations to continue to sing and dance. But if must you sing and dance, you must recognize that it is true political activism, not partisan political activism, but a political activism that is geared towards the liberation of the group as an oppressed people. That our organizations must become more overtly political. As we said in the statement, Frederick Douglass reminds us, power concedes nothing without a demand. Do not allow the PPP and its government to continue to tear us apart, to continue the attempt to drive us apart, to divide us. Let us together make this decade a fruitful decade for African peoples and all the peoples of Guyana. I thank you all so much for tuning in at short notice to this short press conference, if you will, this short press statement, if you will. And please do share it widely. Thank you all so much for being with us for this short intervention.
When we speak of civil liberties and civil rights, people are beginning to understand that the most fundamental of these is the right to work in our society. And what is occurring in Guyana is that the government is making political capital out of the indefensible position of one who is either unemployed or is very close to the line of being unemployed.
I want to say to you all, in no uncertain term, that this government is disrespectful to black people. And if people disrespect you, you have a right to disrespect them.
I am saying now that we have started, now that we have come together, do not sleep. Don't let us go back quietly into the night. Protest must be the order of the day.